Comme d'habitude, si vous parlez, je vous demande de lever la petite main juste pour pas qu'on passe. Aussi de vous mettre en sourdine parce que la quantité de personnes qu'on a, s'il y a du bruit de fond, ça peut être dérangeant. Aussi avec les interprètes à l'écran, c'est important que les gens qui, s'ils ne parlent pas, aient leur caméra fermée. Donc, en anglais, in English, so please mute yourselves if you are not speaking and also be off screen if you are not speaking. But please raise your virtual hand if you are if you want to talk, basically. Oh, a frog in the throat. So yay, animals. Merci. Je vais essayer d'avoir de l'attention un petit peu sur le chat et aussi sur les participants. So I'll try to split my brain in two within the scope of having interactions with you as well as reading the chat. But when I project the presentation on screen, I'll have a hard time. So I don't know if Jean-Emmanuel, t'es là. I might ask you to wingman for me. Sorry for the... He's like caught off guard. He's like, qu'est-ce que tu veux, Marilyn?
Yes, I'm here.
C'est correct si je te demande de garder un œil sur le chat parce que quand je projette, je ne verrai pas nécessairement les commentaires. C'est correct?
Oui.
Tigilou, merci. Okay, before we start, any questions or comments? No? I see there's a lot of people. So I will contextualize. Initially, we had the ESDC task force that was to come and present to us their consultation process. However, the guides are not approved yet, and they are not translated yet, so they could not come. And they have been told that the Treasury Board Secretariat will lead the consultations for the internal public service en français. Donc, initialement, on devait avoir le secrétariat qui s'occupe de la révision de la loi sur l'emploi dans la fonction publique. Désolée, pas ça du tout. La loi sur l'équité en matière d'emploi. Et puis, malheureusement, leurs guides ne sont pas approuvés et ne sont pas traduits. Donc, ils ne pourront pas être présents. De plus, ils ont avisé que dorénavant, ça doit être le secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor qui mène les consultations pour l'ensemble de la fonction publique. Je n'ai pas eu les précisions quant à agence centrale, non agence centrale, so I didn't get the specifications about core and non-core and what does that mean. But hey, we'll have this conversation because we have people from both core and non-core here. Questions, comments? We're good. Questions, commentaires? Ça fonctionne. Donc, je vais projeter la présentation. C'est guidou. Donc, j'y vais. Donnez-moi un petit instant. It's loading. Okay, let me know once you see it.
We can see it.
Merci. Okay, so that's me, that's us. Puis, dans le contexte, si jamais vous ne l'avez pas eu dans les deux langues officielles, ça va me faire plaisir aussi de vous l'envoyer, mais je l'ai envoyé, ça fait un petit brin de temps. Là. So within the scope of key highlights, when Madame Blaquette, as well as the Minister of Labor, when they did the announcement that the report was out, these were the three key items that they discussed. La diversité est un fait. L'inclusion est un choix et l'équité, c'est la loi. On le sait parce qu'on travaille en équité, on sait qu'il y a des grands besoins. Puis, je vous ai mis aussi le lien là, par rapport au tout le document, si vous avez vraiment du temps et de la motivation à lire ce grand document. So within the scope of the EE report, we saw a need for sustainable coverage data justice, rethinking the groups, and within the scope of the same announcement as the report coming out, they announced 2S LGBTQ plus would become a group as well as Black employees. Removing barriers, which has always been the goal of the initial EE Act, meaningful consultations, as well as regulatory, sorry, that word in English is painful, regulatory oversight. So what does it mean for like our usual governing bodies comme la Commission canadienne des droits de la personne, par exemple, and regulatory implications. Donc, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire en termes de suivi? Puis là, je vais demander aux gens d'interagir avec moi. Donc, ce que je vais faire, c'est vraiment, je vais passer à travers chaque diapo, puis on aura un moment d'échange entre chaque diapo. So I'll just go between each slide and ask folks for a moment of interaction. So it's not a Marilyn speaks to herself festival. So I will put it up and then we'll chat and then I'll do that. And it's going to potentially annoy some folks, but I'd rather see faces and speak with people than speak to myself. So within the scope of the recommendations that, and again, this is my own lens on this specific report. So recommendations that made sense, I think, in terms of impacting our work. The purpose of this act is to achieve and sustain substantive equality in the workplace through effective employer implementation, meaningful consultations, and regulatory oversight of employment equity, and in the fulfillment of that goal. Data collection and benchmarks should be rethought to eliminate barriers and foster data justice. And then I open up the floor for people to interact on those two recommendations. Because really, what we're trying to do here is for us to have a conversation, and then when we're able to do potentially the TBS consultations or an ad hoc summary or condensé, dans le fond, une soumission indépendante. On va vraiment utiliser la conversation qu'on a aujourd'hui pour avoir la conversation avec le secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor ou pour soumettre une soumission indépendante à la personne ou l'organisme qui est en train d'organiser tous les renseignements par rapport à ce qui doit être colligé. Et ce n'est pas encore fait. Comme je l'ai dit, les guides de consultation n'ont pas encore été approuvés ni traduits. So, initial thoughts on the two first recommendations. Okay, one keyword, benchmarks. Are we okay with the current benchmarks that we have? Benchmarks being WFA. Okay, voilà. Hein, Kirkaya, go ahead.
You knew I was going to jump in here.
Ben oui, c'est bien ça.
So I'll be honest, I have some concerns when we talk benchmarks. A lot of the benchmarking that has been done historically will look at things that are, and I understand we need to look internal to Canada, but we're looking at very old models that don't look at innovative or new solutions or trends that other countries may be utilizing. We're not necessarily looking at private sector, how some of those benchmarks and applications are being done. The other concern I have, in a sense, when we talk benchmarks, back to the bare minimum. Oh, and I'm frozen again. So I'm not sure if my voice is coming through. My computer has had issues, so it keeps dropping on me. I think I'm back now. So when we look at it, we talk about WFA and people create targets, but those targets are mathematically based targets. So we're always destined to fail. Those targets based on benchmarks are WFA says we should have 10 Indigenous employees, so we set 10 for a department. The minute one individual leaves, we've missed the mathematical target. We're not including what are the chains for supply chains of where are these individuals coming from? How early do we have to connect with them? So the benchmarks, with the way that it's presented, my concern is we're going to draw back to that original way of benchmarking that focuses on mathematical targets and not on the goal, which is to remove barriers and obstacles to full participation. So that would be the statement I would offer on benchmarks. Yes, Deborah absolutely hit it on the head. It's tokenism and benchmarking. It's not done in a way that is trying to address the fundamental underlying issues. So that terminology, I think, has to be expanded and explored to understand why are we setting targets and what are those benchmarks actually designed to achieve. Does it mean we've met the EEA requirement of now our workforce is representative, but representative for how long? I don't consider it success if we're representative at one short period in time. I'd like to see the federal public service be representative so that if 1, 2, 3, 5 people leave a department, we still have representation, because otherwise we lose those values. I have issues with that. So just something I wanted to share. And hopefully I didn't speak too fast.
No, that went well. So I just wanted to say, I will summarize super quickly. Donc, pour les collègues francophones qui ont peut-être besoin d'avoir le résumé de Kirkaya, les commentaires étaient vraiment à propos d'avoir un chiffre qui n'est que de façon temporaire. Dans le fond, on atteint ce chiffre-là, mais la seconde qu'une personne part, on n'est plus représentatif. Donc, c'est vraiment de regarder au-delà des chiffres et de ne pas tomber non plus dans le symbolisme de on est représentatif parce qu'on rencontre un pourcentage de représentation, parce que les enjeux sont souvent beaucoup plus profonds que de simplement avoir des gens présents. Donc, c'est vraiment, on le sait, il y a des barrières à éliminer outre la représentativité. Je vais retourner au Cali.
Donc, dans le fond, je me souviens quand on avait eu la première, dans le fond, rencontre avec, justement, l'équipe qui avait, dans le fond, présenté les recommandations. Puis, il y avait eu comme un commentaire qui m'a fait un petit peu, un peu eu peur, parce qu'il disait « ça va prendre du temps à faire ça, puis ça va prendre tellement de temps que est-ce que ça vaut la peine d'étudier cet aspect-là? » Fait que, tu sais, je me dis, comment ils vont évaluer les différentes recommandations? Est-ce que si ça prend trop de temps, laisse faire, on va les mettre de côté? Donc, tu sais, je veux juste assurer qu'ils comprennent aussi que même si ça prend du temps, je veux dire, let's be honest, tout prend du temps au gouvernement. Donc, aussi bien commencer tout de suite que retarder la chose. Fait que, je pense que c'était juste comme un commentaire qui avait été passé qui m'a vraiment, en tout cas, je m'en souviens encore. C'est juste quelque chose que je me dis, c'est pas parce que ça prend du temps que l'importance du travail ne devrait pas être faite, là. Donc, juste ça que je voulais comme juste spécifier pour faire sûr qu'ils n'oublient pas, dans le fond, un peu, même si ça prend du temps, mais on peut commencer tout de suite, là.
Merci beaucoup, Kelly. Just for English colleagues, Kelly was saying one comment she remembers from the last conversation we had with the EE task force was saying how long some items would take. Therefore, are we focusing solely on the time it takes to implement, or are we focusing on the measures or the recommendations that make the most sense? So just wanted to emphasize that specific item. Merci, Kelly. Jackie?
Just on Callie's point, made me laugh because all we do is consult, and we don't do anything. So, maybe part of the recommendation is maybe this act should be reviewed in stages or more frequently. They take action on one aspect of the act during a certain period. So there is change, gradual change, maybe not all the change at once, because taking all the recommendations into consideration, making the change, that is enormous, and that will take a lot of time. So maybe they look at some key, maybe in the consultations, they look at, okay, what's the number one thing that needs change, right? And that's where they put the initial focus, and then move on to the next priority, and break it down, because yes, everything in government takes an enormous amount of time, and we'll be 10 years down the line before we see any change again.
Thank you, Jackie. Mon petit résumé en français. Puis Emmanuel, je pense que tu veux me parler aussi, juste avant que je perde mon idée. Jackie dit de potentiellement considérer faire ça en étapes. Donc, on sait que c'est clair qu'il y a certaines recommandations qui vont prendre plus de temps. Donc, pourquoi ne pas adresser étape 1, on fait celles qui sont des quick wins, là, les plus rapides. Étape 2, on y va vraiment avec celle à moyen terme. Et après ça, étape 3, par exemple, celle qui pourrait prendre jusqu'à 10 ans parce qu'au gouvernement, tout prend du temps. Donc, merci, Jackie. GE, t'avais-tu besoin de moi? Ou
Ah oui,
c'est correct? Oui,
c'était
vas-y.
juste pour te demander si tu pourrais peut-être toucher pourquoi est-ce qu'on utilise le WFA comme benchmark. So maybe if you could address why we're using the WFA as a benchmark.
Do I have to? I'll become the target here. Non, non. Non, ben, je peux expliquer un peu why it came about. And then I don't necessarily agree with the WFA, but within the scope of what we do, so basically the StatScan does the census. This goes through National Occupational Category Coding with ESDC. Then there is a matchup of, well, the labor market availability goes with the ESDC, National Occupational Category codes, and then it puts into perspective how many of each group you should have within the workforce based on the census representation at that specific time within the core, because I know we have people who are non-core here. Within the core public service, that data set is also merged with the pay files from the oui, ça. La réponse à la question dans le chat, yes, that. So within the scope of the core public service, they take the LMA's labor market availability numbers, and then they match it with the pay files, and that gives us an extra set of filters, which gives us WFA, but it also induces more time in terms of accessing information. And again, we're working with 8-year-old data at this point, so it's not that I agree or disagree with the context. I'm just explaining how it is used. Est-ce que c'est ça tu voulais, Jean-Emmanuel, comme info?
Oui, c'est bon, merci.
Tigidou, merci.
On a une autre main levée. Patricia?
Oui, bonjour. Merci pour cette présentation. J'aimerais faire du pouce sur tout ce qui a été dit. Puis aussi, dans la présentation, il y avait l'aspect du data-driven. Donc, est-ce que au lieu d'avoir juste des benchmarks de target, de chiffres, qui influencent beaucoup aussi les directions, d'atteindre juste des chiffres, mais de ne pas atteindre le côté plus qualitatif de l'expérience employée, si on veut, est-ce qu'il va y avoir une intégration de l'expérience employée au niveau du sentiment de belonging, au niveau du sentiment d'équité en emploi, au niveau d'avoir accès à de la formation, de la promotion, pour pouvoir développer le talent de tout le monde. Donc, je ne sais pas si ça, c'est déjà dans parce que je suis nouvelle là, au fédéral. Donc, je veux juste voir, est-ce que c'est quelque chose qui est en cours de route et qui va être intégré ou qui est peut-être déjà intégré, mais ça prend du temps, comme on disait plus tôt, tout semble prendre du temps. Donc, je veux juste voir à quel niveau il y a ce côté-là d'expérience employée.
Puis là, je vais dire, c'est là que avoir différents systèmes devient compliqué. Je vais juste résumer, Patricia, rapidement. Patricia is wondering if beside the representation targets, if we're looking at employee experience, and I said, this is where the complexity of having many organizations using many different surveys and capturing that belonging aspect in different ways becomes the difficulty or the obstacle to what we're trying to remove, because CORE will use PSCS, let's say Public Service Employee Survey. Some organizations will do individual surveys, but really, I don't know if there is such a place that a survey could be put measuring employee belonging, because one key reminder here, in terms of the Employment Equity Act, yes, it addresses regulations or requirements for the core public service and non-core public service, but also there are a whole lot of people or a whole lot of organizations that are federally are regulated and don't belong to the public service. So then it's like, what kind of measures could they use? Donc, je vais résumer pour les collègues en français. Super belle question, super belle idée de la part de Patricia. C'est là qu'on voit qu'avoir autant d'organisations qui relèvent de la même loi, ça devient compliqué. Donc, par exemple, on a le sondage auprès des fonctionnaires fédéraux qui serait un bel outil, mais encore là, il s'adresse vraiment aux fonctionnaires fédéraux. Donc, qu'est-ce qui arrive avec les autres entités qui sont sous législation fédérale et qui ne s'adressent pas nécessairement à la fonction publique. Donc, ça en vient dans la complexité. Une autre belle pratique qu'on avait dans l'ancien temps, parce que j'ai 80 000 ans, donc dans l'ancien temps, on utilisait aussi les données du staff à des fins de plan d'action. Donc, on voyait par exemple les groupes EE disaient telle chose, bon, ben on va mettre en œuvre quelque chose pour adresser les enjeux identifiés. On ne voit plus ça dans la plupart des organisations. Donc, c'était une belle pratique qui n'est plus nécessairement courante et on a perdu au cours des années. So just to summarize my quick answer as well, in terms of PSCS numbers, we used to capture information. We used to disaggregate by EE groups in the very old days because I'm 80,000 years old. But within the scope of those activities, we would identify like an action plan for each of the groups to address the barriers or the feelings that had been identified within the PSCS. But throughout the years, this has just disappeared, although we continue with the survey. Merci. C'est beau avec cette diapo-là. Je vais passer à la prochaine. Si do, on fait ça. Now I have twice the same presentation. Let me know if one of them works. GE, see something?
Yeah, we could see the first, the recommendations, 2.1.
Merci. So establishing an equity data steering committee and allow for intersectional and disaggregated data collection. Allow the equity data steering committee to look at projections, sees the use of WFA. So basically, as we go within the scope of the report, it feeds back into some of the previous points we've discussed. And all EE plans should be filed openly and accessible in a database. And I know a few of us had this conversation this morning in terms of core versus non-core EE requirements when it comes to EE plans. So I will put that in the chat as a reminder, and I don't know if people have thoughts or questions. Give me a second.
First question from Kirk.
Somebody else had their hand up before me, actually.
J'arrive. J'arrive, pas de souci.
Bing He has their hand up before I do.
Hello, Bing.
Hi. For the data steering committee, what kind of level or engagement you're thinking of?
Well, yes. So this would be to be defined, I guess, by the people in charge of the EE Act. But I'm thinking similarly, unfortunately, to some of the specific task force that exists. Let's say we talk about values and ethics. Let's say we talk about reconciliation. I think I'm pretty sure it would be in a similar format in terms of ADM or DM levels and participation at that very high level. Hopefully it would include StatScan, ESDC, Treasury Board, but I don't know that I am right. Je vais juste reformuler en français. Donc, Bing se demande c'est quoi qui serait potentiellement la structure. Ça va être probablement déterminé dans le contexte de la révision à la loi. Puis, selon moi, ça ressemblerait à d'autres groupes de travail qu'on voit, par exemple, sur les valeurs et éthiques ou sur la réconciliation, donc avec un sous-ministre qui est nommé, puis après ça, d'autres sous-ministres de d'autres ministères, potentiellement avec espoir. StatScan, puis par exemple ESDC, puis le secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor. I don't know if that answers your question, Bing.
It did. Thanks.
Merci. Kirkaya?
Okay, so number one, in terms of 2.1, establishing an equity data steering committee, my comment is going to be it has to be a representative one. I keep seeing so many of these steering committees that get stood up, and people from marginalized communities, representation is not there. It's all well and good to say, let's establish a steering committee. My concern is that depending on how it's created, what that mandate is, what the powers of that steering committee, in a sense, will be, I have concerns. There's a lot of times where, again, what we see often is people will go, well, we have women, so that represents, one of the groups. That's great. But do you have a bunch of white women, or do you have women with disabilities from marginalized, racialized communities, part of the queer communities? What does that representation look like? So that's number one. The intersectional and disaggregated data, I agree with. Again, I have a degree of concern. And here's why. I see a number of departments when they're looking at their EE data. If they have a Black woman with a disability, that individual falls into 3 different sets of communities, and they're often viewed as 3 checks, one for each of those communities. And I have a huge problem with that. This work, EEA, is supposed to talk about bringing different perspectives to the table. That individual brings one perspective. As a person who is gender fluid, a man and a woman, a person with a disability, I don't bring a queer perspective, a perspective as a woman, a perspective as a person with a disability. I don't check 3 boxes for my organization. I check 1. So the intersectional component, I agree with. The disaggregated data collection, I agree with. But how it is done, I have not heard anything that yet provides me any sense of confidence that it's going to be done in a way that doesn't force individuals almost to pick one of their identity factors to say, this is the most important part of who I am. And that's what people have been forced to do. So, Jackie, if I may, because you're on screen, it would be like somebody saying to Jackie, you have to pick. Are you a person who is racialized? Are you a person who's a woman? Like, what is more important to you? Nobody gets that right to even ask Jackie that question. So that has me worried. The last one, CCW, the use of WFA. Yes, please. Long past, wholly supported. The open filing and accessible in a database, I like it, but one of my questions is, what is it necessarily going to do? There has to be an intent. Is it intent that people are going to be required to look at what other departments are doing? Is it, I hate to say this, going to be a little bit like the clerk's call to action response letters where they're put on a website and in a lot of cases people don't look at them? There's a lot of work that goes into that. And if we're going to do that work, there needs to be a reason and there needs to be an impact. Otherwise, it's asking people to do something, organizations and individuals, for the sake of clicking a box. And yes, I feel like I'm talking a lot about tokenism. There's great colleagues who are pointing it out. That tokenism, I'm seeing it a lot, and especially with potential changes in government, or so we say political setting in environments these days, that tokenism is becoming stronger and stronger. So I like the recommendations, but how it's done, it has to look at tokenism as one of the primary. We cannot repeat those mistakes. So those are just my quick thoughts. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais juste résumer rapidement. Donc, Kirkaya a parlé avec, par rapport à capter l'information en lien avec l'intersectionnalité, puis que souvent les gens s'auto-identifient comme appartenant à quelques groupes ou à quelques facteurs identitaires, apparaissent 3 fois au lieu d'une dans les chiffres, puis qu'on ne devrait pas non plus demander, de 1, ça fausse les données, mais de 2, on ne devrait pas demander aux gens de choisir une seule identité à laquelle ils ou elles appartiennent. Donc, il y a cet item-là. Oui, on devrait arrêter d'utiliser les DPA parce qu'on sait tous et toutes que c'est très archaïque et c'est vieux et ça prend du temps. Puis pour les plans posté, affiché à l'externe dans un contexte qui ressemble un peu à l'appel au greffier, ça pourrait devenir quelque chose de symbolisme encore plutôt que du vrai travail. Donc, c'était ça les commentaires en très peu de mots. Jackie.
Those of you who have seen me in other meetings, I'm going to start sounding like a broken record. You know, all this consultation, I don't understand really what is going to be the purpose of the steering committee. I came across something the other day that I maybe should have been familiar with, but wasn't, and it was some task force on diversity and inclusion that existed some years back, I think 2019 or something. And I was looking at it. I still have to spend some more time on it. There were 44 recommendations in this. So they spent a year, put together this task force, and I'm sitting here going, where are the outcomes of those 44 recommendations? What happened after that? We do all this stuff. We have these steering committees. We make these plans. They never follow through. The biggest thing, and I don't know where this fits exactly, is the accountability piece. And again, I don't have the answer as to exactly where that fits, but let's just stop saying the same things over and over again, because that's all the consultations do. We present a lot of the same suggestions, recommendations. They're coming from all ends, but they're not being applied. They're not being taken seriously. They're not being even considered. And this is why we can't get anywhere. And there's no accountability to do so. So, my 2 cents worth.
Merci, Jackie. And if it is of any comfort to you, I know the report that you are referring to when I did the first EE plan at Justice in 2019-20, that was serve as a basis for the activities identified within the scope of the EE plan. So I know which one you're referring to. You're referring to the joint task force between bargaining agents and TBS.
Yeah, and it's like, is there a report on the outcomes of that?
Non, j'ai
exactly,
pas vu.
exactly.
Ouais.
So they spent all this time, come up with 44 recommendations for what?
Exactement, c'est. Donc, Jackie fait référence, oui, le rapport, je vois que quelqu'un vient de le mettre dans le clavardage. Donc, il y avait eu un rapport, puis je ne sais pas si elle est là, mais il y avait eu un rapport qui avait été rédigé, co-rédigé entre des syndicats ou des agents négociateurs et le secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor. Puis, il y avait 44 recommandations. Donc, on se demande qu'est-ce qui est arrivé une fois que le rapport a été suivi. Puis aussi, quelles sont les mesures d'imputabilité? Donc oui, on fait des rapports, on fait des recommandations, mais après quoi? Donc c'est vraiment le quoi et comment est-ce qu'on peut mesurer, dans le fond, les impacts de ces différents rapports, de ces différentes recommandations. Alaya?
After being away for 2 years. And so in some ways, it's like nothing's changed, unfortunately. But in other ways, I may be coming, because I don't have all the context, so I apologize. But I wanted to touch on both what Kirk said as well as Jackie. Thank you, Jackie. That was very refreshing because I've been feeling like that. And before I left for 2 years, I'm pretty sure we were talking about some of the same stuff and saying similar things about what comes of it. So I empathize with you, and it is one of those pain points. So I'm not sure how to phrase this and if this would be of help in any way, but when we talk about like all these different task force and all these things and we're not seeing anything come of it, is it because the people who are working on it, we understand they're not representative, but in any case, the people working on it, are they all public servants? Are they all people who are just like, are we creating this inbred system of people who are doing stuff and then it's just, we're just perpetuating and then, 1 step forward, 5 steps back and not really moving the needle? Or do we have some capacity or way to engage a more public forum or advisors or something from outside of real experts who are then able to hold us accountable? And do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, I know way back in another life when I was working on the youth employment strategy, we actually got experts from different organizations in the field who created, and I can't remember what they called it, whether it was an advisory committee or some sort of like board that was not public servants. And there was real like outputs that they had to put out. Again, I don't know what happened with the accountability piece on that, but I wonder if it's different when it's something more public facing and we have to demonstrate or show response or accountability versus internal. So I just want to leave that as an option of all this. And, you know, the disaggregated data piece has been talked about, I think, like upteenth amount of time. So I won't get into that, but that's kind of where I'm just wondering, how do we drive this forward and not turn it into something that sits in a parking lot again and is revived because some other person had to die in another way that, you know, sparked this. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you have a very valid point in terms of the further recommendations in the end of the report. They do speak about an equity commissioner. That would be something separate from the Canadian Human Rights Commissioner. So maybe that's where maybe accountability would come from. But true, it's the same types of reports that we see, similar recommendations, but potentially having people from the outside that hold our feet to the fire would be very interesting in terms of making sure that we deliver. Donc, Alaya demandait, est-ce que ce sont toujours les mêmes personnes ou le même type de personnes qui font partie de ces comités ou ces groupes de travail-là? Parce que certains programmes, par exemple, si on prend des consultants ou on prend des intervenants externes, il y a un certain, une certaine volonté ou un certain besoin d'être transparent et de rencontrer ce à quoi on s'est engagé. Donc, est-ce que c'est parce qu'on est juste tout le temps visé vers nous qu'on ne livre pas, dans le fond, quand ça vient à l'équité en matière d'emploi? Merci. Any last thoughts? Dernières idées sur cette diapo-là où je peux changer? Leon, I saw you had your hand, but then it went away.
All good.
Okay, merci. And then we shall do this again. And I don't know that we'll get through all of them today, Miss Gum. If we don't, we might schedule something in 2 weeks because anyways, it's us and we can chat. Sorry about that. I knew we were on 3. Recommendations 3.6, 3.7, and 3.8 undertake meaningful consultations and create a framework with Indigenous peoples around self-identification based on UNDA. 3.9 and 3.12 use the definition of the Accessible Canada Act. 3.14 women should remain a group. 3.7 Black workers to be added as a group. 3.18 to LGBTQI plus workers to be added as a group. And 3.22 visible minorities to be replaced by racialized peoples. And then I shall put it in the chat.
Already beat you to it.
T'es bien hot. Merci, Jean-Emmanuel. C'est une compétition. Yes, Caroline, happy to see you.
Yeah, happy to see you guys too and to hear all this wonderful conversation. So with respect to 3.6, 3.7, 3.8, and probably 3.4 and 3.5 as well, I pulled together a bit of an approach for ESDC labor for the Indigenous related recommendations that are in the report. And they will be following through with that approach, perhaps slightly modified, not sure, because I haven't checked in with Sandra for a while, but they were very receptive to what was shared with them. And it was Deputy Minister approved, both CERNAC and ISC. Okay, so there is a process and an approach planned for the Indigenous related recommendations in the report.
Beautiful. And will we get to see it is my next question.
Probably, but not right now.
Okay.
They're really hyper focused on trying to get the commitments that were made publicly done first, And then they know that some of the other recommendations in the consultation that needs to take place in order for implementation to happen has to follow. So focus first on what needs to happen, that the ministerial commitments, and then, okay?
Okay. Merci.
Just because there's an MC.
Yes, I hear that. Thank you, Caroline. Donc, Caroline disait que justement, il y a une approche qui a été définie pour ISDC, mais que pour l'instant, on ne pourra pas l'avoir parce que il y a des engagements qui avaient été pris au niveau des ministres et ils souhaitent les livrer avant. Puis ensuite, on verra l'approche qui a été définie. I see Kirk Kaya.
My apologies. You know, I have comments on a whole lot of it. This is one of the slides where I had a number of specific comments. The first one on the 3.6 to 3.8, something that I have been hearing, and I'm not Indigenous, I'm going to be upfront about that. But what I've been hearing when we talk about self-identification, we talk about the challenges and issues with using monolithic terminology. It's one of the reasons why visible minorities, the recommendation to move towards racialized minorities, still has an issue. It's why we're seeing Black communities saying that monolithic terminology did not help, did not work. What I've been hearing from some Indigenous colleagues is the same thing is happening using that term Indigenous. First Nation, Métis, Inuit have very, very different experiences. And so there is a perspective that I hear growing, and I could be wrong, but it's something which anyone working on that, I hope, explores with those sets of communities is Indigenous even going to be the right term that those individuals want from moving forward around, self-identification? Or does that group different sets of communities and nations together in a way that perhaps eliminates some of the barriers or struggles that one community is having over the other? The 3.14 for me was absolutely terrible. And not that women are recommended to remain a group. The fact that that is basically the only recommendation that applies to women misses the mark. It perpetuates that we still have done all these things for women. It's in a great place. Number one, I don't believe that. I still see colleagues who are women experiencing barriers and challenges. For gender diverse women, I see even more challenges, and we're seeing it in a lot of places. There's still that discussion of, and I hear this almost daily, when the terminology in the law is women, that automatically includes gender diverse women. But there's a lot of places where it's being applied as female, and these are not the same terms. And so in places, the terminology is actually being misread intentionally to exclude some women. Black workers being added as a group, 100% supportive. I have no concerns there. What I will say is I hope the government is considering that this is setting the precedent for other racialized communities to make the same request or demand under the legislation. There is not only one set of racialized groups or communities that is experiencing barriers. So that is one thing that hopefully people far smarter than I am on that task force within government have been thinking about. For 2S LGBTQI, and I'm going to say A+, I really have concerns. I think, yes, there are barriers there 100%. What I will say is, one, the sheer fact the nomenclature drops the A, and no, the A is not for allies, it's for asexual and agender individuals. Those are two of the most discriminated groups in the queer communities. So to continue, I know that's the acronym that was selected, but to now put it into legislation in a way that disappears two of the most impacted and affected groups, especially under this type of legislation, has me worried. Number two, within the queer space, what we see in a lot of terms of initiatives, whether it's positive space, whether it's groups, activities, whatever the case may be, there's a focus on sexual orientation over gender expression, gender identity, because sexual orientation is better understood. So when this legislation goes in, how it is written, I'm very concerned that even though we see under the Canadian Human Rights Act, we see those 13 grounds that have the 3 separated, that we're going to see it grouped, and it's going to be grouped in a way that deals with the set of communities, sexual orientation, that is more understood. And in terms of visible minorities to be replaced by racialized, I struggle with this in a sense, not the updating of the terminology, but I hope that racialized is what individuals who are part of those communities requested. Because there still is a component that when we look at it as a verb, this is something that was done to people. And I agree. I think that race has been turned into a racialization, something that is imposed on people. But I hope that that terminology was terminology that was very much requested by sets of communities that are racialized. Because again, there's going to be fallout for some, maybe even the majority. That may be the terminology that is wanted. But what happens for those where that terminology causes additional re-triggering of trauma, of issues? So just when I see changes in terminology, I really hope linguists and people from communities were the ones who got together to make those recommendations. So ça c'est tout pour moi. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais juste résumer brièvement. Donc, Kirk Kaya dit oui au premier item, mais ensuite, il y a certains enjeux qu'on a même à mentionner que les femmes doivent demeurer un groupe d'équité. Ça démontre qu'on ne connaît pas encore les enjeux que les femmes confrontent, dans le fond, dans le milieu du travail. Oui, pour l'ajout du groupe des travailleurs noirs, le 2E en français, LGBTQI+, il y a certaines dimensions à explorer, là, donc dans certains domaines, on va vraiment vers le sexe biologique plutôt que sur l'identité de genre, ce qui est vraiment un enjeu. Le fait aussi qu'on ait omis le A dans l'acronyme qui fait référence à non-genré, en français, ça se dit mal, là, non-genré ou asexuel, alors que ce sont des communautés qui subissent aussi beaucoup de discrimination. C'est pas optimal, si je peux dire. Puis, Kirkaya a mentionné que le changement de terminologie vers personnes racisées devait vraiment venir des communautés et non seulement du groupe de travail. Donc, en très peu de mots. Merci. Gabi, hello.
Okay, great. My mic's working. Hi, everyone. First off, I want to thank Kirkaya again for your comments. They were bang on. Just to sort of add to some of the things mentioned already, for me, one of the things I find really interesting as someone who does sort of straddle that line between, yes, I am white, but I am also Métis. And so I always really struggle with self-identification because for me, my Métis culture, while it is still something that is a part of me and something I embrace, it's not how I am perceived in the world. And so when I'm filling out my check boxes on the EE Act, do I fill out, 4 of 5 or whatever it is, but there's no space in the way we present it. It treats them as discrete categories. So if I'm filling out my, idea as a racialized person, like, no, I'm not racialized, I'm white. But then I also say that I'm Métis, but there's no space for me to say that I'm mixed and Métis. Like I'm not just quote unquote Métis, I've got French Canadian, Scottish, English, all this other stuff. And so I always feel really like I struggle with when to disclose and what to disclose. I know that, checking the box is great in some chances, but do I want that to be used for statistical purposes versus, am I in a specific pool for Indigenous people? Like all of those things really matter in terms of how I choose to identify. And similarly, when we look at the Accessible Canada Act and the definitions, those definitions, while they're in the right direction, they're still not quite accurate. And because we have a growing population of people who don't identify as persons with disabilities, but who do in fact live with disabilities. Okay.
Hello, there's somebody that's, if you can mute yourself if you're not speaking. Merci.
Where was I? Yeah, sorry. So there's a lot of people as part of those communities that don't feel like they're part of, they're not disabled enough. They don't have a diagnosis. They don't have the medical paperwork, all of that kind of stuff. And so, or again, they don't want to disclose that because of the very obvious stigmatization they receive. And so in a similar way, when we go to, looking at the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, why would you want to disclose those parts of yourself if we're, potentially going to be working for a government that is in a couple of months going to be actively working against supporting those colleagues? So why would you put that down? Why would you mark that you're part of that community when they're facing open hate from potentially the people in charge of your employment, right? And so I really wonder, and I think about the self-ID with the Indigenous people and how many people falsely claim Métis identities because they either don't understand or because they know there's no mechanism to check. I wonder how many people will do that with the queer community. And again, I'm not saying that I think people shouldn't be taking up that space or people who are questioning shouldn't be part of the community. Like, that's not where I'm going with it. But we're going to run into similar issues, 5-10 years down the line where people are going to say, well, you can't question my sexual orientation. You don't know who I sleep with at home. So, if we're going to be using those as ways to ensure accurate representation and retention of, discriminated against communities, we're also going to run into the same problems that we run into with self-ID in some of those other communities. We're already facing that issue with persons with disabilities, right? Like, if you look at any department's accommodations process, we are effectively re-traumatizing people daily by making them deal with the medical system or deal with the bureaucracy, and even the staff that are there to supposed to support them often have really ableist views. So again, like, all of these are great in that they need to be done. The language needs to be updated. I'm glad they're included, but I don't think that just changing the definitions and then hoping people are going to self-ID and not having any proper discussions about like how that self-ID is done and the possible, like, again, like, I just think all the time of how we look at the government stats for Indigenous, and we have like twice as many Métis people as First Nations. And if you look at population distribution, especially given the fact that most of, the public service works in Ottawa, that just doesn't make sense, right? Like, that's not where the communities are from. Why is there double the percentage of Métis people in Ottawa than in Manitoba, right? Like, anyway, so those are some of my thoughts. And thanks again to everyone else who's talked, because you probably said it better than I did.
Non, c'était parfait, merci. Je vais juste résumer rapidement. Donc, Gabrielle, avec ses identités spécifiques à elle, dit c'est difficile de même trouver une façon pour elle de s'identifier d'une façon qu'elle trouve qui fait du sens là, dans les identités actuelles. Et puis que c'est toujours difficile pour les gens de s'auto-déclarer ou s'auto-identifier, d'identifier leurs facteurs et de les partager. Par exemple, si on parle d'orientation sexuelle, qu'ils commenceraient à avoir justement ces enquêtes-là par rapport aux vies personnelles des gens, surtout quand on sait qu'il y a un nouveau gouvernement qui pourrait bientôt se présenter, qui n'a pas nécessairement des vues favorables envers certains des groupes. Donc, c'est vraiment, oui, c'est le fun d'avoir des nouvelles définitions et une terminologie à jour, mais ça serait bien d'aller aussi travailler sur les enjeux auxquels ces identités-là font face. In very few words. Dear Darren, go ahead.
Hello, folks. How are you? I'll turn my camera on. Why not? Well, being a person probably has been involved with the EE Act since its inception back in 1994, actually technically, but for the federal government, 96. I've always had some misgivings with all the groups, quite frankly, and so I would start with 3.14 of women. I always felt, and the data shows us that it kind of perpetuates the glass ceiling in a way, right? Because we use workforce availability based on occupational group. So, for example, if an employer is underrepresented at the AS1 level, is that a bad thing? because that's where women are, because structurally, women find themselves in society as well, find themselves in those types of roles, primarily because there may be primary caregivers and other things that don't allow them to move past those kinds of classifications. So when we continue to have goals for those groups, for that category, we're actually in some ways perpetuating or the status quo. I've always believed that the Equity Act should be really distinguish between what I call STEM, or STEM trades, and women in executive positions only. And we should actually move away from measuring WFA in the lower category. So I've always felt that the primary goal for women should be more in the leadership group, past that traditional glass ceiling, and we should be really that should be the focus, not just being in a group and measuring all levels of classification. As a Black public servant, I'm obviously happy to see Black workers being added as a separate group. But keep in mind as well, and I think it's been said, that there's a lot of diversity within that group as well, right? So if you look, the real fundamental flaw of the Equity Act, it doesn't and I think it's been said, it doesn't recognize the diversity within each group. And I think, and I'll skip to I'll call it the Pride community or 2S LGBT. There's no group that's probably more diverse in terms of experience or their lived experience than the 2S LGBTQ plus A group, right? I mean, you think about it. Does a gay white male have the same experience as a trans person in the workplace? The answer obviously is no, right? And so maybe the privileges that a gay white male may have are not the same privileges that a person who is trans may have, right? Or lack thereof. So is it fair to do that? To sort of make this assumption that everybody is the same within such a broad and diverse group, and I believe no. So I've always been hesitant to add that group particularly to the EE Act because of that fact, and also because of the practical sense, we got no way of measuring the data and getting accurate data. And I think it's been said, I think there's a lot of members of the community who don't want to have what activities that take place beyond in the bedroom being disclosed in the workplace. That I've had friends of mine who are members of the community say that it's none of anybody's business. I remember when we first, in fact, when we first used the 2S LGBTQ in the public service employee survey. I was in the Atlantic region at the time, and I had at least 3 members of the community say, "It's none of your business. Why are you asking in the public service survey whether or not I'm gay or whatever I am? That's none of your business." And I remember those conversations because it was the first time I realized that, yeah, I see where you're coming from. So I think that will continue to exist. So we don't have data. We do have data on Black workers, correct? We can certainly have disaggregated data. We know if you can self-identify as. Well, we don't have data on the 2S LGBTQ2+ community. And even if we do, if some miracle, the Public Service Commission is able to come up with a new platform that they've promised for so many years, it'll take years as well in order to make that data accurate and usable. Right? Even once everybody is in, and then can we trust the data? Right? Do we know that given the fear of disclosure, I think it's higher than the fear of disclosure with disability, quite frankly, and I think for good reasons. And I don't think that I think we should be very cautious when we do that. So the other concern is when you're adding these 2 new groups. In a sense, the Black community is saying, well, we're ready to go now. We have the data. We know that we're underrepresented. We know that substantive equity doesn't exist in our population. But are we ready to, until they figure out how to measure other groups before we are able to be included. So in a sense, we're feeling a double-edged sword there. You know, we welcome other groups to be included, but at the same time, we don't want it to be held up for the sake of lack of data for example, the 2S LGBTQ community, if that makes sense. Does that make sense, Marilyn?
Yes, but you knew, we spent too much time together because I was going to say, but what about disclosing if you have a disability? Not everybody feels comfortable, so we
very
spent too
much the
much.
same.
C'est la
Yeah,
même chose. Yes, I know.
yeah. Well, we
Well,
know, for example, that I've done data. I've looked at the data on the public service employee survey for our department versus, you know, obviously the self ID, and more people seem to self-identify, at least per capita or per response, on the survey than on the self ID, which kind of says to me that the population of those with disabilities is underreported with regards to self ID. And again, for the same reasons, I think that, you know, when it comes to whether gender identity or so on. So as a Black person, I think, you know, I've always said we self ID every day we get up in the morning, so it's no big deal for us, right? If you've got an invisible disability though, or if your sexual orientation, whatever, is something that you feel you don't need to disclose, you don't have to, right?
thank you. Yes.
So yeah, sorry.
But
That's me.
no. You know, I like chatting with you. Thank you, Darren.
Course.
Ben oui. Donc, pour résumer rapidement, Darren dit que pour certains groupes, ça serait peut-être pas pertinent, surtout pour les femmes, d'aller dans les catégories professionnelles, par exemple. Est-ce qu'on veut vraiment maintenir un groupe de femmes, par exemple, pour un AS1, quand on sait que traditionnellement, ce sont les types d'emplois que les femmes allaient chercher. Donc, est-ce que c'est pas mieux, par exemple, de viser d'avoir, par exemple, des cadres ou dans les STEM et STEM pour s'assurer qu'elles sont vraiment représentées, où il y avait des enjeux de plafond de verre, on va dire en français. Puis, il a nommé encore, comme Jackie précédemment, et je pense que Kaya, que le groupe des employés noirs n'est pas un monolithe. Donc, c'est très diversifié aussi. Puis, Darren a mentionné l'enjeu avec les données actuelles quasi inexistantes pour les employés 2E LGBTQIA, entre parenthèses, plus. Et que, par contre, il y a des différences, par exemple, c'est que pour certaines personnes, elles ont le choix ou non de s'auto-identifier, alors que pour d'autres personnes, comme Darren mentionnait, tous les matins, n'être que dans le milieu du travail, c'est déjà une auto-identification de par leur identité qui est très évidente et visible. Thank you, Darren. Any other thoughts or questions on this one? And I think we'll only be able to do an extra slide. I don't know how much. We still have like 4 to go. So I'll schedule something in an extra few weeks to be able to get through it, because I think this is a relevant conversation to have. Feel free to tell me if I am wrong. I'm always open to being wrong. And then I shall put it on. Donnez-moi un instant. Sorry. Donc, encore, on recommence au début. Désolé. In terms of recommendations, ESR should be conducted every 3 years instead of 5 or whenever people feel they should. EE plans creation should be supported in the EE regulations. Right fit concept to be replaced by a more inclusive approach. A review who has access to official languages training. consultations with Indigenous groups to provide an Indigenous languages allowance, and as well review the usage of artificial intelligence, which my team knows. Me and AI, it's not my bestest friend. Donc, est-ce que les gens ont des questions, des commentaires par rapport à cette diapo-là? Kirkaya?
Just one quick comment. It's with respect to 4.18 and 4.19. Yes, we have to look at who has access to it. I agree. I agree with looking at a language allowance. I think that falls well short, though. The concern that I have is we know when you look at adult learning, when you look at neuroplasticity for the ability to learn new languages, the more languages you learn, unless you're a very unique kind of individual, the harder it becomes. If you look at, and I'm going to talk specifically about Indigenous communities, there's a lot of times we're asking somebody who may have learned one of their maternal languages first that is not English or French. And this also applies to racialized communities, I would say. We're now asking people, now you have to learn English or French, and now you have to learn English and French, whichever the opposite is as you go higher. Looking at who has access to official language training, looking at language allowances does not still acknowledge the barrier that that creates. You could have equitable access to language training, but what somebody who may now be learning a second or a third language may need is going to be very different. So it's not just about access, it's about the supports, it's about how long. If somebody is from an Indigenous community, a racialized community, they're learning that third language, let's say it's French, they learned English first, they may need 2 or 3 times the amount of time, not because they're Indigenous or racialized, but because of the complexity of adding a third language. So these recommendations for me come across as they're still coming across as very performative. They come across as addressing something that is concrete and easy to measure. Absolutely. It's a great first step. But if departments don't then take the next logical steps to look at, are there still the underlying barriers that addressing access or a language allowance, we're not going to change the fact. I could provide somebody a language allowance, but if they are having challenges from a capacity perspective because it is that second or third language allowance isn't going to make a difference. It isn't going to change anything. So when I read these, those two both came across for me as initial actions, but falling well short of the actual issue. And then in terms of the AI, the usage of AI, it's such a complex point. I don't even know necessarily where to start with it. This isn't the right venue. I do a lot of work on AI ethics actually right these days. What I will say is, again, who's doing the review, number one. And it goes back to the point that Alia raised earlier is, are there going to be external experts in this field that are going to be looking at it? Or are we going to have public servants who have a passing knowledge of AI looking at it? These are not the same thing in any shape or form. And again, the other thing, and I believe it was Jackie who talked about it, how many reviews are we going to do? This is another review. We've seen the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations, the Purge recommendations. There's 40, 50, 60 recommendations that have never been addressed. And we're going to get another set of recommendations. Even the EEA-RTF, another set of recommendations. So AI has bias implicit. The coders add bias even with machine learning theory. So who is it that's going to do that review? Because unless it is somebody who is very, very specialized, and there are not a lot of experts in that field, I'm not sure it's going to add value. So just quick points. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. See, team, this is why. So I always talk against AI and suddenly my computer crashes. So I will be kind and not say anything so we can have this conversation without it crashing. Je vais juste résumer rapidement les points de Kirk Kayat. Donc, c'était une super belle première tentative d'avoir ces deux items-là mentionnés par rapport aux langues. Donc, avoir une bourse, un montant attribué pour l'apprentissage des langues, mais ça n'enlève pas les barrières qui sont créées par les obligations, les exigences relatives aux langues. Donc, souvent pour les personnes, on parle d'apprendre une troisième langue. Donc, ça n'enlève pas ce besoin-là d'aller juste donner de l'argent pour que les gens l'apprennent. Donc, ça serait important de voir quelles sont les étapes additionnelles pour que ça devienne vraiment quelque chose de substantif qui a des changements et des répercussions concrètes. Puis, par rapport à l'intelligence artificielle, on va tenir l'ordi qui ne tombe pas. Kirk Kaya travaille sur justement revoir les concepts d'éthique par rapport à l'intelligence artificielle, mais c'est clair qu'il y a des biais comme dans n'importe quoi. Donc, les gens qui font le codage ont des biais. Puis, en parlant justement d'avoir une révision de l'utilisation de l'intelligence artificielle, est-ce que oui ou non, on va juste se retrouver avec de nouvelles recommandations et de nouvelles révisions à recommander. Donc, c'est vraiment, est-ce qu'on ne s'enligne pas encore pour juste un nouvel ajout de recommandations qui ne sont pas suivies? Donc, je pense que c'est à peu près ça. Est-ce qu'il y a des gens qui ont d'autres commentaires, des questions par rapport aux items qui ont été soulignés? Parce que je pense pas qu'on va pouvoir passer aux autres diapos aujourd'hui. So any more questions or comments on the slides we've seen today? Because I don't think we'll be able to get through. So I'll schedule part 2 of this conversation. We're good. And yes, Caroline is doing amazing work on OL barriers on Indigenous peoples. So look out for more on that. Or if we have a few minutes, Caroline, did you want to speak to what you have done on that front more recently?
Yep, sure.
Thank you.
So just for folks to be aware, we're now entering a phase where we've got a path forward with some proposed case studies and the development of an integrated work plan with the existing OL modernization plan. And that goes before Deputy Minister Wilson on the 27th of March. And so there are components around Indigenous languages, around OL improvements in a variety of different ways so that Indigenous employees no longer face the kinds of barriers that they face. Additionally, we presented to both the commissioners of official languages and Indigenous languages on March the 8th. It was well received. The Indigenous Languages Commissioner asked if he could take our materials and put them into the annual report. So there's a variety of things that are moving and at play, and more to come essentially for folks that aren't aware of what we're up to.
Merci beaucoup, Caroline. So looking forward to more on that front. I don't know if people have an issue in terms of me putting this recording as I usually do, in terms of making it accessible on YouTube. And I've been in conversation or in exchanges with Professor Blackett as well. She might be able to come and join us at a later date. So I'd like for her to see the types of conversations that the report has generated. Donc, je vais le dire en français aussi. Donc, je ne sais pas si les gens sont d'accord que je mette accessible cette vidéo-là sur YouTube, comme je fais habituellement à des fins de partage avec la communauté. Puis, si c'est correct que je le partage aussi avec Professeur Blackett, avec qui j'ai eu certaines conversations certains échanges, pas conversations, mais par écrit, parce qu'elle peut venir nous jaser éventuellement. Donc, je dirais qu'elle comprenne le genre d'échange qu'on a au sujet du rapport qu'elle a mené. Caroline?
Yeah, just one quick thing. Professor Blackett spoke at Carleton University on Friday, and I was there. And she and I had the opportunity to have a conversation. And so we're going to continue to converse about some of the Indigenous related recommendations that are in the report. And she's also quite interested in the work that we're doing on OL barriers.
Beautiful. Thank you. Any last questions, comments from people, things you're trying to advertise? No? Ça va? D'accord. Quick info maybe, because I know a few of you have asked the 5,000 letters for hires for people with disabilities. Expected in a few weeks. It had not been approved within the scope of TBS. Clerk's call to action expected in a few weeks as well. It has not been released. And I did share last week, I want to say, a message about values and ethics. So jointly with the clerk's call to action, or just about at the same time, there's going to be requests to report in on values and ethics. Donc en français. Pour ceux et celles qui se posent la question par rapport à la lettre sur l'embauche de 5 000 personnes en situation de handicap, la lettre n'a pas encore été approuvée dans la chaîne d'approbation au secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor. Le rapport pour l'appel du greffier sur le racisme et la discrimination n'a pas encore été approuvé, n'est pas encore lancé, mais d'ici quelques semaines, même chose pour un certain rapport. J'ai fait circuler un courriel la semaine passée. Là, il va y avoir aussi une demande d'un rapport sur les valeurs et éthiques, pratiquement en même temps que celui sur l'appel du greffier. Donc ça aussi, là, je vous le dis parce qu'il y a beaucoup de rapports au mois de mai. On s'attend aussi à celui sur le multiculturalisme canadien qui habituellement sort plus tard à l'été. So I'm mentioning it because I know how many reports we have to do, especially at this time of the year. So there's those 3 items coming through, and there's also the multiculturalism report that is supposed to come this year in May instead of later in the year as it usually does. So just for you to be able to plan all of these beautiful reporting exercises without stressing out, I think irrelevant to flag them. Donc, un grand merci à tout le monde. Puis, je sais qu'on finit un petit peu plus tôt, mais des fois, ça fait du bien de respirer. Puis, on va se rejaser dans quelques semaines. So, thanks everybody. I know we're ending a little bit quicker than expected, but I think it's a good breather and we'll connect in a few weeks. Bien, merci beaucoup. Thank you, everyone. Take good care. Prenez soin de vous. And thanks for the interpretation. Merci aux interprètes aussi. Super apprécié.
Marilyn?